My name is Serafina Lowell. I am 67. The room was bright with Christmas lights, the scent of roasted turkey and pine needles thick in the air, but none of it reached me. I stood frozen, my hands clutching the edge of my empty plate as my daughter Elaine's words echoed through the dining room. "You didn't contribute anything to this dinner, so you don't eat." Time slowed. I watched my grandchildren, Ava and little Mark, chatter excitedly about Santa Claus, oblivious to the cruelty of the moment. My husband had been gone for 3 years, and I had moved into Elaine's house thinking family would mean safety, warmth, and respect. I had been wrong. The table was laid out beautifully, the centerpiece I had carefully arranged earlier in the day, catching the soft glow of the fairy lights. I had spent hours preparing chopping vegetables, setting out dishes, and polishing the silverware. I had bought presents for the children, even a pearl necklace for Elaine, hoping it might soften her heart. And yet, here I was, treated like a stranger in the home I had helped maintain for years. Elaine's husband, Ron, lifted his glass in a toast as if nothing had happened, his smile faintly smug. I could hear the clinking of silverware as the family began to eat, and my stomach twisted. I wanted to step forward to explain, to tell them I had been in the kitchen all afternoon, but my voice caught somewhere in my throat. All I could do was hold my plate, trembling, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. A small piece of bread fell from the table, and Mark, unaware of the tension, looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes. "Grandma, do you want some?" he asked, holding it out. My heart ached, but before I could answer, Elaine's sharp voice cut through the air. "Mark, go back to your seat. Grandma is fine. She's just learning a lesson." I swallowed, feeling the sting of tears that threatened to spill, and slowly turned away. Each step toward the stairs felt heavier than the last, echoing in the quiet corners of the house that was no longer my own. I shut the door behind me and sank onto the edge of my bed, the holiday decorations I had hung that morning now looking like a cruel mockery. The soft twinkle of the small Christmas tree caught my eye. I had set it up for the children, and it should have been a symbol of joy. Instead, it felt like a spotlight on my humiliation. I clenched my hands in my lap, trying to steady my racing thoughts. How had it come to this? Every act of kindness, every dollar contributed, every hour spent caring for this family had been ignored, twisted, or used against me. And yet amid the shame and the sharp ache of betrayal, a quiet spark flickered inside me. It was not hope, not yet, but a sense of awareness. The weight of all these years, the subtle dismissals, the small cruelties that had piled up like snowdrifts, settled in my mind. They had assumed I would remain silent, that I would accept my place as a ghost in my own family's life. I pressed my forehead against my folded hands and took a deep, shuddering breath. Tonight had been different. Tonight had forced clarity upon me, and though I did not yet know how, I sensed that something would change after this night. I would not remain invisible. The distant hum of conversation downstairs, the laughter and clinking of dishes, faded to a background murmur as I began to gather my thoughts. Tomorrow, the house would seem just as normal, just as bright, but I knew I could never see it the same way again. I closed the door softly behind me, the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking cutlery fading into a dull, oppressive hum. The warmth of the living room mocked me, a cruel contrast to the cold knot in my chest. I sank onto the edge of my bed, hands folded tightly in my lap, and let the silence stretch around me. The room smelled faintly of lavender, a scent I had carried from my late husband David's study, and it reminded me of mornings spent with him before the world felt heavy and unkind. I remembered how he would pour coffee into my favorite chipped cup while I read the newspaper, his hand brushing mine with gentle insistence that life was worth every struggle. Those mornings felt distant, now fragile as glass. I thought of all the sacrifices I had made for this family, choices I had never regretted, because I believed in love and duty. I had worked long hours as a seamstress, rising before dawn to stitch, mend, and save for their future. I had poured myself into their lives, every dollar, every ounce of energy, hoping that in return I would be seen respected, even cherished. And yet tonight, the cold reality pressed in. Elaine's words replayed endlessly in my mind, sharp and deliberate. You didn't contribute anything, so you don't eat. I had prepared the table, bought gifts, peeled potatoes, cleaned dishes, every act meant to bind us closer, but none of it mattered. I had been reduced to emptiness in their eyes, a mere fixture in their house, to be used and ignored at will. The tears I had held back threatened now, but instead of letting them fall, I breathed deeply and tried to steady the turmoil inside. In the stillness, sorrow began to morph into something else. A clarity that cut through the pain. I could feel the weight of years spent bending, giving, accommodating. And now, for the first time in a long while, I saw the pattern, the subtle manipulations, the quiet erasure of my presence, the assumptions that I would always comply. A strange steadiness settled over me. The humiliation had been acute, yes, but it had also illuminated the truth I had avoided. I could no longer live as a shadow in my own family's home. I traced the outline of the Christmas tree with my eyes, the lights twinkling like distant stars. For the first time, I imagined a future where I was in control of my life, where my contributions were valued, where my presence mattered not as a source of convenience, but as the woman I had always been. I leaned back against the headboard, allowing my mind to wander along the possibilities. Change, I realized, would begin with a single decision. And tonight, something inside me had shifted quietly, irrevocably. The first day I arrived at Elaine's house 3 years ago felt like stepping into someone else's world. I had been alone since David passed, the silence of our empty home pressing in on me, and when Elaine insisted I move in, I trusted her words. Mom, you won't be alone. You'll be surrounded by family. We'll take care of you. It was a lie that I clung to, desperately believing that love could fill the spaces left by grief. From the moment I stepped over the threshold, the unspoken rules became clear. I was welcome only so long as I contributed financially, physically, emotionally, but never truly included. My modest pension, which I had painstakingly saved over decades, became the backbone of their household. I gave $600 a month toward the bills, yet every expense seemed to draw a silent, reproachful gaze from Elaine. The electric bill ran high. That was my fault. The heating cost too much in winter. Surely I could find a way to help. I prepared breakfast for the children before school, waking at 5 each morning to make oatmeal, scrambled eggs, and toast. I tidied the house while they slept or got ready cleaned after their pets folded mountains of laundry and ran errands that always seemed to multiply. I became the invisible thread holding the household together, a caretaker who was expected to anticipate needs and fix problems that were not mine to solve. And then there were the children, Ava and Mark, little bundles of energy and curiosity who adored me and assumed I would always be there. I helped with homework, braided hair, washed sticky hands, and soothed nightmares. Each smile or hug I received felt like a small repayment, but it could never outweigh the constant sense of being taken for granted. Every gesture I made was quietly assumed a duty rather than an act of love. Elaine herself demanded perfection. Meals had to be timed to her schedule, floors swept to her standard, and gifts wrapped just so. I bought supplies for crafts food for dinners and even contributed to birthday parties and holiday events, all without complaint. But any deviation, burnt toast, a late dish, a misplaced toy, was noted, criticized, or worse, ignored entirely until it became a reason for subtle punishment. The first Christmas, I remember feeling a pang of hope when I carefully prepared gifts for the children and set the table for the dinner she insisted I help organize. Elaine glanced at the decorations, barely nodding, and moved on. my effort was unseen. Over time, frustration built quietly, a slow erosion of my patience and self-regard. I began to notice the small manipulations, Elaine directing every movement, Ron making jokes at my expense comments, masked as concern that left me doubting myself. Even as Ron struggled to find work, I paid for groceries and household expenses, helped with repairs, and carried the bulk of the domestic load. And when he eventually secured a job, the gratitude never came. Instead, their reliance on me only became subtler, cloaked in the pretense of family unity, while I remained a source of financial and physical labor. I kept thinking of David in those moments, how he would have quietly praised my diligence, how he would have reminded me that my worth was never measured by obedience or expense. Without him, I had to remind myself. I had given my life to my family, yet it never seemed to matter. Each day passed routine after routine, the weight of unacknowledged effort pressing on me until frustration hardened into resolve. I was still capable of care, still capable of love, but I was learning the painful lesson that generosity, when taken for granted, could be weaponized against the giver. It was in these quiet, exhausting years, the hours unseen and unthanked, that I began to understand the truth of my situation. I was a fixture, a contributor, a ghost, and the realization settled heavily on my shoulders. If I did not reclaim my dignity, no one would give it back. The life I had built with David, the peace I had once known, had to be found elsewhere, somewhere beyond the walls of Elaine's house, where my value would not be measured solely in dollars or duty, but in the simple acknowledgement of my humanity. The mornings began quietly, but the tension never did. Even the smallest actions seemed to carry judgment. I would set the table for breakfast, arranging the cutlery just as Elaine liked, and she would glance up, shake her head slightly, and mutter, "Careful, Mom, you'll spill the juice again." Her words were casual, almost offhand, yet each one pressed against my chest, leaving a small, persistent ache. Ron was no different. He would comment on how the heating was too high or that the refrigerator was always full, implying it was somehow my responsibility. Even though I had contributed financially and spent hours tending the house, the invisible expectations weighed heavier than any tangible task. I began to notice the subtle patterns. Every request, every correction, every sigh was a gentle erasure of my presence, a reminder that I was never quite enough. In the kitchen, Elaine would micromanage every meal. She instructed me on how to peel vegetables, even though I had done it the same way for decades, and criticized the timing of when dishes should go in the oven. The turkey should be ready by 6, Mom, not 5:55. Timing is everything, she would say. Her tone clipped, as if any small deviation was a personal failing. Her eyes scanned constantly, observing my movements, evaluating my work as though it were a performance that could never meet her standard. Even in moments when I expected warmth, I found cold precision. The children, young and perceptive, often mirrored the household energy. Ava would glance nervously at me when I hesitated with a plate, and Mark sometimes hesitated to ask for help, uncertain if it would draw Elaine's sharp attention. I realized painfully that the atmosphere in the house had conditioned them to obey caution, to fear mistakes. The subtle hostility had infiltrated their childhoods as completely as it had infiltrated mine. I began keeping track of the patterns almost unconsciously. Small comments about money, remarks about chores, the occasional sarcastic smile, each one building a landscape of quiet tension. I understood then that this was not merely oversight or impatience. It was deliberate, a consistent, unspoken message that my presence was tolerated only when useful and invisible when inconvenient. There were days when I could feel my own patience stretching thin, yet I persisted, quietly internalizing the slight discomfort and disguising the sting behind calm smiles and polite nods. It was exhausting, living in a house where approval was measured in the absence of error and acknowledgement was measured in silence. I had become acutely aware of every glance, every fleeting expression, every unspoken critique. Even during the holidays, moments that should have felt joyful were tainted by scrutiny. Decorations placed perfectly would still earn a critical eye. Meals prepared with care would be met with a brief dismissive comment. Each day, the small slights, the passive-aggressive remarks, and the micromanagement accumulated into a steady, relentless pressure. I could feel it in the way my shoulders tensed in the quiet sinking of my chest each evening. And yet, amid the irritation and growing resentment, I began to recognize the clarity forming within me. The patterns revealed the truth. I was no longer living as a member of a family that valued me. I was merely a fixture useful only when convenient. That awareness, though painful, gave me a strange, focused strength, hinting that the next step, whatever it would be, was mine to take. The house was quiet now, the hum of the heating and the faint clatter of dishes from earlier fading into the background. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands. The memory of Elaine's words still sharp in my mind. You didn't contribute anything, so you don't eat. My chest ached, but amid the sting of humiliation, something else stirred a quiet, insistent energy that felt foreign yet urgent. I thought of the hours I had spent that day, the careful trimming of the Christmas tree, the peeling of potatoes, the arranging of gifts and dishes, all done with hope that this holiday could finally be a moment of family warmth. Instead, my labor had been met with contempt, my presence dismissed as irrelevant. I clenched my hands, feeling the frustration that had built over 3 long years press against my ribs, and I realized it had grown into more than just anger. It had transformed into resolve. For so long, I had absorbed every slight, every microaggression, every silent judgment, convincing myself that endurance was a form of love, that patience was a virtue. Yet patience had never been reciprocated. Endurance had never been acknowledged. And tonight I understood that my dignity was not something to be borrowed from others. It was mine to claim, mine to protect. I remembered David, his quiet wisdom, the gentle insistence that my worth was never defined by others' approval. If he were here, he would have reminded me that standing firm was not arrogance, it was survival, it was self-respect. I breathed deeply, the memory of his voice filling the hollow ache in my chest with something steadier. The sorrow remained, but it had changed shape, becoming a tool rather than a weight. I began to trace the path of the day in my mind, noting every moment of service, every invisible act of care, every dollar quietly spent, every evening spent soothing fears or mending small disasters. And I realized how calculated the household had been in taking it all for granted. Elaine and Ron had relied on me not for love, but for convenience. My presence had been tolerated only as long as it served their comfort. That clarity was a spark, small but relentless, flickering into a flame. I leaned back against the headboard, feeling the energy grow warm and steady beneath my skin. Tonight marked a turning point. I would no longer allow myself to be used, dismissed, or humiliated. My life, hard-earned and long-lived, demanded recognition even if it came only from me. The decisions I had put off, the confrontations I had avoided, the subtle manipulations I had endured, all now formed a map for action. I thought of the steps I would take, gathering evidence of their schemes, reaching out to old friends who could offer refuge, reclaiming control of my finances, and finally asserting myself in a way that could not be ignored. The plan did not need to be dramatic. It only needed to be deliberate, measured, and irrevocable. The fire in me had shifted from anger to determination, and I could feel the weight of inertia lifting. As the night deepened, I rose and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-blanketed streets of Chicago, the faint glow of holiday lights reflecting off the frozen pavement. The world seemed still, almost expectant, as if it were waiting for the first step. I tightened my grip on that thought, the knowledge that I had finally seen the truth, and that nothing could force me to return to invisibility. Tonight, the humiliation had ended, not with a shouted rebuttal or a dramatic scene, but with a spark that would grow into a fire capable of reclaiming my life. The house was empty the next morning, the soft light of dawn filtering through the blinds and casting pale stripes across the floor. I waited until I was certain Elaine and Ron had taken the children to the Christmas market, a tradition they insisted upon every year. The quiet was heavy but necessary. I had made up my mind I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. I moved cautiously through the hallway to Elaine's bedroom, my pulse quickening with a mixture of fear and determination. Her phone rested on the nightstand, plugged into its charger as always. I had observed her habits over the years, memorized the codes she used for everything: birth dates, anniversaries, patterns of convenience. Today, that knowledge would serve me. With trembling fingers, I entered the unlock code she had carelessly chosen, and the device slid open immediately. The screen lit up, revealing a chat group labeled Family SM. My stomach tightened as I scrolled through the messages, the casual brightness of her profile picture now a mask for something far darker. The messages were devastating in their clarity. From December 20th, I read Ron's words. "I can't stand your mother in the house anymore. She's in the way all day. We need to keep her happy until everything is arranged." Beatrice's response was even colder. "I know, but we need her pension. Once she's gone, we'll have our space again." I felt the air leave my lungs. They had been planning this for months, perhaps years, manipulating every gesture, every word I spoke to ensure compliance. A nursing home, cheap and isolated, had been scouted in advance. The cost, the arrangements, the sale of my personal belongings, everything calculated in advance. Even the children were part of the plan, positioned as a pretext to convince me the move was temporary, that it was for my own good. Scrolling further, I found messages from November, detailing which personal items could be sold, how to convince me I wanted to go willingly, and a particularly chilling note where Beatrice confessed, "Last night, I dreamed Mom died there." I didn't feel sad, just relieved. Finally, the house to ourselves. My hands shook as I read each line, the cold precision of their plotting, leaving me both furious and disbelieving. I began to photograph every screen, capturing dates, names, and conversations. This would be evidence, a record that could never be dismissed or denied. The weight of betrayal pressed down like ice. I had spent 3 years giving, serving, sacrificing, and none of it had mattered. Instead, it had been leveraged against me. My good intentions turned into a tool for someone else's gain. When I finally set the phone aside, I felt a strange clarity. The humiliation of Christmas Eve had been only the surface of the truth. Behind the polite smiles, the holiday rituals, and the casual greetings, Elaine and Ron had been calculating, patient and methodical, in their plan to control my life and my money. The realization made the world around me sharper, brighter, as if seeing through a fog for the first time. I walked to the window and looked down at the snowy garden, the moonlight glinting off the frost. The world was still, but I could feel the tremor of change beginning to ripple through it. I understood now that action was inevitable. Awareness alone was no longer enough. I had to move to reclaim the life they had tried so carefully to erase from me. The first step, I decided, would be deliberate, measured, and undeniable. Tonight, everything would start to change. I spent the morning gathering my thoughts, the chill of the winter sunlight streaming through the blinds, doing nothing to warm the icy resolve settling in my chest. The phone had revealed everything, a window into months of calculated cruelty and manipulation, and now I needed to turn that knowledge into action. I opened the messages again, scrolling carefully to ensure nothing was missed. Dates, times, names, and details were all crucial, every line a piece of the puzzle. Ron's casual comments about my presence being inconvenient, Beatrice's cold discussions about the nursing home, the plans for my pension, even the offhand remarks about my belongings, all of it would be recorded. I photographed each conversation, holding the phone steadily, despite my trembling hands, making certain that every detail was clear and readable. Once I had captured the messages, I printed each screenshot and laid them out across the bedspread. The papers formed a mosaic of betrayal, every conversation, a stark reminder of how meticulously they had plotted against me. I arranged them by date, making sure the narrative was clear and indisputable. Seeing them spread before me, I felt a peculiar sense of power. For the first time in years, I was no longer invisible. I was armed with the truth, concrete and undeniable. I took a deep breath and considered the next steps carefully. Acting in haste would serve no purpose. The strategy had to be measured, deliberate, and precise. I began to draft a plan. First, I needed a safe place to stay, someone I could trust completely. Patricia, my neighbor and longtime friend, immediately came to mind. Her home had always been a sanctuary, a place where words could be spoken honestly and without fear. I would need to move without alerting them to gain the freedom to act while retaining my safety. Next, I considered my finances. The pension I contributed to their household had been the backbone of their comfort for years. It was time to reclaim control, but not recklessly. I would need the evidence in hand before making any changes, a shield against any claims or protests they might attempt. Each step had to be calculated, every action backed by proof. Finally, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. The fear and shock from discovering their plans had begun to transform into something sturdier, something empowering. I realized that the humiliation, the invisible labor, the constant dismissal, all of it had led me here to this moment where I could finally assert my own agency. For the first time, I felt a quiet but firm certainty that I could turn the tables, not through anger or rash decisions, but through careful planning and unwavering resolve. I gathered the printed messages into a manila envelope, sealing them carefully. It would accompany me when I left, a tangible testament to the truth I had uncovered. Holding it in my hands, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. The path ahead was not without risk, but for the first time in years, I sensed that I was stepping into my own power, reclaiming a dignity that had long been denied. I looked around the room one last time, the soft glow of the winter sun casting long shadows across the walls. Everything had changed. I was ready to move, to act, and to take control of the life that had been quietly stolen from me. Today, I was no longer a silent observer of my own betrayal. Today, I became the architect of my own justice. I dialed Patricia's number with a hand that refused to stay steady, my heart drumming with a mix of fear and determination. It had been years since we spoke regularly, the distance of my move and the weight of my own embarrassment keeping me quiet. But today, I needed someone I could trust completely, someone who would see me as I truly was, not as a source of inconvenience. Serafina Patricia's voice came through warm and familiar, laced with surprise. "It's been ages. How are you, dear?" Her concern, genuine and unhurried, contrasted sharply with the cold calculations of Elaine and Ron. I swallowed, forcing my voice to remain calm. "Patricia, I need a favor," I said carefully. "It's urgent. I can't explain everything over the phone, but I need a safe place to stay for a while." There was a pause on the line, a moment that felt both heavy and necessary. Then she said without hesitation, "Of course, Serafina. You know you're always welcome here. The guest room is free, and I would be glad to have your company. Since Anthony passed, this house has felt too quiet anyway. Her words washed over me like sunlight breaking through a cold morning. I felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. Patricia had always been like a sister, someone whose kindness was consistent, whose home had always been a refuge. I need you to be discreet, I added. I don't want them to know where I am, not yet. I need time to prepare to think. Discretion is not a problem, she assured me. Come whenever you are ready. You don't owe anyone an explanation. Her tone carried no judgment, no impatience, only understanding. I exhaled slowly, a tension I hadn't realized I was holding in my chest, easing slightly. Making the call had been the first act of courage, but receiving her acceptance made the possibility of action real. I began to think through the logistics, what I could take, how to leave without drawing attention, and how to keep the envelope of evidence secure. Every detail mattered, every precaution a step toward reclaiming my life. Patricia continued, speaking of the house, small updates, the warmth of the kitchen, the quiet of the neighborhood. Her words grounded me. For the first time since the humiliation at Christmas dinner, I could imagine a place where my presence would not be a source of irritation, a place where my choices mattered. The contrast between her warmth and the coldness I had endured made the path ahead seem clearer, sharper. We spoke a little longer, and I allowed myself to imagine what it would feel like to cross the city and arrive at her door, leaving behind the years of frustration, the silent labor, the emotional weight that had built in Elaine's house. It would not be a solution to every problem, but it would be a sanctuary, a starting point. By the time I hung up, the first stirrings of determination had strengthened. I felt lighter, not because the danger was gone, but because I knew I had an ally, a witness, and a place to begin. The cold, calculating world of my daughter and her husband had been interrupted by something real, something human, and that warmth, that certainty was enough to push me toward the next step of the plan I had begun to form. The house was silent. The low hum of the furnace, the only sound accompanying the occasional creak of the floorboards. I moved quietly, careful not to disturb the slumber of the children, the rhythm of their breathing, a reminder of innocence, tangled in the web of deceit. On my bed, I spread the manila envelope containing the printed messages, the evidence of months of calculated betrayal. I stared at it for a long moment, letting the weight of all I had discovered settle fully in my chest. I reached for a pen and a sheet of stationery, the kind I had used for letters to friends and family in happier times. My hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from the gravity of what I was about to do. I began to write each word chosen carefully, measured, and deliberate. Dear Elaine, I wrote after much reflection, I have decided that it is time for me to find a place where I can live with the peace and respect I deserve at this stage of my life. I paused, letting the ink dry slightly, feeling the tremor of emotion beneath the calm facade. This has not been an easy decision, but recent events have made it clear that my presence here brings tension rather than comfort. I described without bitterness the years I had spent contributing to the household, caring for the children, and managing both domestic and financial responsibilities. I did not write to accuse or to lash out. This letter was a declaration, a final acknowledgement that I would no longer be invisible or disposable. I hope that by stepping away, you will be able to enjoy the privacy and peace you desire, and that the children will continue to know that I love them deeply. Folding the letter carefully, I placed it on the pillow in my room, a subtle first impression for anyone who might come searching for me. The envelope of evidence rested beside it, a silent guarantee that the truth could not be ignored. I stood and began packing a small suitcase with the essentials clothes for a week. Medications, the photographs of David that had always been by my bedside. I moved deliberately, each item chosen with a sense of necessity rather than sentimentality. Once my preparations were complete, I paused at the door and looked back at the room I had called home for 3 years, a home that had never truly been mine. The decorations I had hung for the children, glimmered softly in the low light reminders of a joy I had once imagined, now tinged with the sorrow of betrayal. I took a deep breath and smoothed the wrinkles of my coat, letting the determination in my chest solidify. I slipped out of the house, closing the door gently behind me, careful not to rouse anyone. The streets were quiet, the cold night air sharp against my cheeks, invigorating in a way that reminded me I was alive, capable, and finally free to act. Each step carried the weight of years endured and the promise of control reclaimed. By the time I reached the car, waiting nearby, the envelope and suitcase secure beside me, I felt a calm I had not known in months. This was not a flight, not an escape in fear. It was a deliberate, dignified movement toward autonomy. For the first time, I understood that leaving did not mean losing everything. It meant reclaiming the life, the respect, and the freedom that had been denied to me for far too long. I started the engine, the low hum joining the quiet of the city night, and pulled away, my mind already moving forward to the next steps, the actions that would ensure that the years of servitude and humiliation were transformed into a future built on my own terms. The morning air was crisp as I walked along Michigan Avenue, the winter sun low and pale against the towering buildings of downtown Chicago. My steps were deliberate, each one echoing the resolve that had taken root during the night. In my bag, I carried only the essentials, documents, identification, and the envelope of evidence I had meticulously prepared, but the weight of my purpose pressed heavily on my shoulders. Today, I would reclaim control over what had been quietly taken from me. The First National Bank loomed ahead, familiar yet distant, a place I had visited countless times over the past 15 years, but never with such intention. I entered and approached the personal accounts desk, where Julian, my longtime account manager, looked up with polite recognition. "Good morning, Miss Lowell. How can I help you today?" I took a deep breath and met his eyes steadily. "I need to make some important changes to my accounts," I said. "I am removing a co-holder and stopping all automatic transfers. I also want to open a new account in my name only." Julian nodded, setting aside his paperwork. "Certainly. We'll need a signed authorization to remove the co-holder. May I ask why I chose my words carefully? I am taking full control of my finances. That is all you need to know for now." My voice was calm, measured, leaving no room for argument, no trace of hesitation. The moment demanded precision, and I could feel the tension in my chest, steadied by the certainty of what I was doing. He brought out the documents, and I signed each one deliberately, aware that every stroke of the pen reinforced my autonomy. The co-holder, Elaine, would no longer have access to the pension I had contributed, the transfers I had permitted for household expenses, or any indirect control over the resources I had worked so hard to save. It was a quiet, calculated act of reclaiming what was mine, a strategic assertion of power that would ripple through the household without confrontation. Next, I focused on establishing the new account. Julian walked me through the options, suggesting a checking account with direct deposits and a separate savings account with fixed-term certificates. Each choice was deliberate. No shared access, no automatic withdrawals, full oversight in my hands alone. By the time the forms were complete, I felt a tangible shift in the air, a quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that the foundation of my daughter's leverage had been dismantled. I lingered for a moment, reviewing the printed confirmation of the changes. The numbers were no longer abstractions. They were a statement of authority, a tangible representation of the years I had been used, manipulated, and dismissed. Every dollar I had entrusted was now secured, every automatic transfer stopped. The power that had been quietly drained from me for years now rested firmly in my hands. As I left the bank, the city streets seemed different. The winter light glimmered off the glass towers, not as a backdrop to fear or submission, but as a canvas reflecting the clarity and resolve I had cultivated. Each step back toward the quiet streets of Lincoln Park was filled with a sense of accomplishment, a measured triumph that carried no malice, only the assertion of dignity long denied. I paused at a small cafe, taking a seat by the window, and allowed myself a brief moment to drink in the scene, people rushing past, some hurrying to work, others strolling with children in tow. The world continued as it always had, indifferent and relentless. Yet I had carved a space within it where I held control, where my decisions dictated my life. By the time I left the cafe, I felt a calm certainty I had not known in years. The strategic moves were complete. Elaine could no longer manipulate the household through my pension, and I had established a secure foundation for the next steps. Today had been about more than money. It had been the first act of reclaiming a life that had been quietly controlled, the first measure of freedom taken after years of invisibility. For the first time, I understood the weight and the satisfaction of power held in my own hands. By late morning, the phone on the small kitchen counter began to ring incessantly. I had just settled into Patricia's apartment, unpacking a few essentials, when the first call came through. The screen lit up with Elaine's name. I hesitated for a moment, letting the sound of her panic wash over me before pressing the speaker. "Mom, where are you? Why didn't you come back last night? The children are asking for you." Her voice was frantic, clipped with the kind of fear and urgency that only surfaced when control slipped from her grasp. I allowed the silence to stretch for a few beats, the hum of the apartment around me accentuating the tension. "I'm fine, Elaine," I said evenly, my voice calm, deliberate. "I'm in a safe place where I am treated with respect. I have everything I need." Her breathing hitched and she tried to speak again, words spilling out in a jumble of pleading and excuses. I didn't mean to. You can't just leave like this. The children, they miss you. We need you." I raised a hand, cutting through her rush of panic. "I am not leaving because of whim or anger. I am leaving because the circumstances here have made it impossible to live with dignity. You were warned by my actions and my letters." I expect no further explanation. Another call came immediately after, followed by a third. Each time, Elaine's tone escalated from urgency to desperation. And each time I answered with the same measured calm, reinforcing the boundaries I had established. I listened to her rationalizations, her promises, her apologies, masked with concern, but I did not respond with anger or panic. Her calls no longer carried power over me. They were simply the echo of her own miscalculations. Even when her voice became shrill, invoking the children, I maintained composure. Ava and Mark were innocent, caught in the turbulence of adult mistakes. I did not allow their names to become weapons against me. "The children are not responsible for your choices, Elaine," I said quietly. "They will be safe, and I will maintain a relationship with them on my own terms, not as leverage for your comfort or guilt." As the hours passed, the calls became more frantic, each one a reminder of the influence I had held over their household through finances and compliance. Now, with that influence removed, I could see the panic in her repeated attempts, the fear of loss that had never touched her before. I realized with a quiet satisfaction that the foundation of their control, my pension, my contributions, my quiet acquiescence, was no longer there. I allowed the sixth call to go through, fully listening as Elaine's voice trembled, shifting from panic to pleading. "Mom, please. I just want to talk. The house, the money, everything was so dependent on you." I nodded to myself, even though she could not see it. I had expected this moment, anticipated the reaction, and I was prepared. "Elaine," I said, firm but without malice, "everything that depended on me is no longer your concern. I am no longer a participant in your calculations. I am here safe, and I am in control of my own life." By the time the calls stopped temporarily, I felt the clarity settle deeper within me. The panic, the pleading, the frantic energy, they were all evidence of the shift that had occurred. For years I had been invisible. My value measured by convenience and money. Now the control was mine entirely, and the sound of her desperation only confirmed that the balance had changed irreversibly. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Patricia's balcony, the city streets below quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic. I had been expecting them, though I did not know precisely how Elaine would approach. A car pulled into the small lot, and my eyes followed it instinctively. She stepped out. Her face tense, flanked by Ava and Mark, both clutching small toys and looking cautiously toward the building. Elaine's expression faltered as she realized I had seen her. She straightened, adjusting her posture, attempting to appear casual, though the tightness in her jaw betrayed her. The children glanced between us, sensing the tension, their young faces a mixture of curiosity and unease. I leaned against the balcony railing, arms crossed the envelope of evidence tucked safely in the pocket of my coat. "Mom," Elaine called, her voice tentative at first, then rising slightly as she tried to assert control. "Please, we just want to talk. We just want to explain." I shook my head slowly, my gaze sweeping over the children, before settling on her. "Elaine, there is nothing to explain," I said firmly. "You have already said everything that matters." She opened her mouth, hesitated, and then finally stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I know you're angry, but we can work this out. You plan to send me to a nursing home." I interrupted, my voice steady, despite the heat rising in my chest. "You discussed it in detail, calculated every step, spoke about my pension, as though it were your property, and even dreamed about my death, as if it were a liberation for you." The words landed like stones. Ava's eyes widened, and Mark clutched his sister's hand, uncertainty written across their small faces. Elaine's lips parted, a flicker of panic crossing her features. She opened her mouth to speak, but I raised a hand to halt her. "Do not speak until you have looked at this." I pulled out my phone and held it so she could see. The screenshots of messages scrolled on the screen, the discussions about costs, the arrangements for my belongings, the casual cruelty woven through every line. Her face drained of color as she read, her composure crumbling in the clarity of exposure. "This is the truth," I continued, my voice unwavering. "For 3 years I have been a fixture in your house, contributing everything I could, my time, my labor, my money. And it was used against me, planned carefully and methodically." Ava's small voice trembled as she asked, "Mom, is this true?" Mark looked up at me with wide, questioning eyes. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my tone calm but firm. "Yes, it is true. But it is not your fault. You are innocent in this. What matters is understanding that some adult actions can be cruel, even if they seem confusing." Elaine's hands trembled as she reached for her children, trying to shield them, but the shield was meaningless against the evidence laid bare. "Serafina," she began, voice breaking. "You don't understand. It was never meant to hurt you." I shook my head. "It was meant to control me. That was the purpose. The children do not belong to this plan, and I refuse to let them bear the weight of your actions. Take them back. They should not witness further manipulation or fear because of what you intended for me." Elaine glanced at Ava and Mark, whose small faces mirrored confusion and worry. Slowly, she nodded, recognizing that the confrontation had shifted power in ways she could no longer deny. She led the children back to the car, their small hands waving briefly before they disappeared from view. I stayed on the balcony, phone still in hand, watching them leave. The quiet that settled afterward was heavy, but it carried a strange satisfaction. The truth had been laid bare, exposed without confrontation or violence, and for the first time I felt the balance of control shift entirely. The planning, the secrecy, the years of manipulation, all had been revealed. I lowered the phone and breathed deeply, the winter air filling my lungs. Today had been the reckoning, the unveiling of hidden intentions. And as the shadows lengthened across the balcony, I knew that nothing could unmake the clarity. Nothing could undo the power I had reclaimed. The sound of shouting drifted up from the street below, sharp and chaotic, cutting through the calm that had settled over Patricia's apartment. I stepped closer to the balcony, eyes narrowing as I saw Ron pacing on the sidewalk, his hands flailing his face, red with frustration. His voice carried harsh and unrestrained. "Serafina, get down here! We need to talk right now!" He bellowed, each word heavy with anger. His car door slammed, echoing off the buildings, and he gestured wildly as if directing a crowd that did not exist. The panic and outrage radiating from him was unmistakable, fueled by the sudden loss of the financial control I had held for years. I crossed my arms and leaned against the railing, my expression calm, measured. The phone in my pocket, the envelope of evidence tucked safely away, gave me a quiet assurance. I would not step down, would not allow fear or intimidation to dictate my actions. He had spent years cultivating the illusion of control, and now that facade was crumbling. "Listen to me. You can't just walk away," he shouted again, the words growing desperate. "The mortgage, the bills, the kids' expenses. Everything depends on you. You can't leave it like this." I shook my head slowly, my voice steady. Everything that depended on me is no longer my responsibility. I have acted within my rights, and I will not be coerced by anger or threats. His pacing quickened, and he stopped chest-heaving, trying to regain composure. He waved his arms toward the apartment, a futile attempt to assert dominance from below. "You think you can just take it all back and leave? Do you know what this means for Elaine? For the children?" The street below seemed to shrink under the weight of his frustration, the wind whipping his hair across his forehead. I could see the desperation in his eyes, the recognition that the financial leverage he had relied upon was gone. Yet I remained silent for a moment, letting him vent, letting the weight of his own loss settle in. "You don't understand. You're being selfish. This affects everyone." His voice cracked, the anger now tinged with panic. He had expected compliance, obedience, and fear. Instead, he met only calm resolve, and it unsettled him visibly. I raised my voice just enough to be heard clearly, firm and unwavering. "Ron, your anger does not give you power over me. Your threats are ineffective. I will not be drawn into conflict on the street, and I will not allow the children to be used as leverage." He froze for a moment, realization dawning in his eyes. The mask of authority, the anger he had wielded for years to control us, was ineffective against steady clarity. For the first time, he faced the consequences of his own miscalculations. Finally, his shoulders slumped, and he muttered under his breath, the roar of his frustration quieting. He turned abruptly, storming back toward his car, the fury still present but impotent. I remained on the balcony, calm and collected, watching him drive away, the tension in the street dissolving into silence. The winter air felt lighter now, carrying a sense of closure and assertion. The confrontation had been unavoidable, the emotional climax necessary, and yet through it all, I had remained composed. The power, I realized, belonged not to those who shouted the loudest, but to those who could hold their ground with unshakable calm. I stepped back from the railing, letting the quiet wash over me. The rage had passed the lesson delivered, and for the first time in years, the balance had shifted entirely. The mornings in Lincoln Park had a calm I had not felt in years. The sunlight poured through Patricia's wide windows, casting a warm glow across the living room, where the small tree I had brought from my old apartment twinkled softly. For the first time since leaving Elaine's house, I could breathe without tension pressing on my chest. Patricia moved around the kitchen with her usual ease, humming quietly as she prepared breakfast. I sat at the table, a steaming cup of coffee in my hands, feeling the comfort of routine and the simple pleasure of being in a place where my presence mattered. The quiet was not empty. It was filled with understanding respect and the soft hum of everyday life. The first few days had been disorienting. I was hyper-aware of my freedom, the absence of control from others feeling almost strange. I walked through the rooms touching familiar furniture and the well-worn floors, reminding myself that I was no longer invisible, no longer measured solely by what I could provide. Each step, each glance around the apartment reinforced the reality that I had reclaimed my life. Ava and Mark's absence was a relief and a reminder of the innocence shielded from manipulation. Without the weight of Elaine's schemes hanging over their heads, the world seemed lighter. I could focus on myself, on small pleasures that had been denied for years, arranging flowers on the table, reading in the sunlight, preparing meals without scrutiny. These moments, though mundane, carried a profound sense of autonomy I had not realized I had craved. I began taking walks in the neighborhood, letting the cold air fill my lungs, invigorating and sharp. The streets, dusted with early winter frost, were a stark contrast to the suffocating warmth of Elaine's house, where tension had lingered in every corner. I felt the years of stress of silent labor and unacknowledged effort begin to unravel, with each step replaced by the simple rhythm of freedom. Patricia and I fell into an easy routine. Mornings were for coffee and planning the day, afternoons for errands or walks, and evenings for reading or quietly sharing stories of the past. There was no judgment here, no pressure to perform or contribute beyond my own desires. I felt myself relaxing, my muscles releasing years of tightness, my mind clearing of the constant vigilance I had carried. I spent time reflecting on the years of service I had given, the sacrifices I had made, and the subtle cruelties I had endured. The realization that I had survived, and had done so with grace, brought a quiet pride. My past was not erased, nor were the scars forgotten, but they no longer defined me. I was present in this moment, in this apartment, in a life I had chosen rather than one imposed upon me. By the time evening came, the soft light of the city filtered through the windows, and I stood on the balcony with Patricia gazing out at the streets below. The air was crisp, the quiet profound. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of inner peace. Fragile but real, a reminder that freedom once claimed could be lived without fear or compromise. I took a deep breath, letting the stillness settle inside me, and allowed myself to imagine that this winter, for the first time in a long time, I was entirely without chains. The news came slowly, filtered through whispers and muted conversations from the old neighbors I still kept in touch with. Elaine and Ron's apartment, once bustling with confident authority, had been quietly put up for sale. The process had been discreet, as if they hoped no one would notice the collapse of their carefully constructed life. I learned of it first through Patricia, who relayed what she had overheard from a friend at the market. I felt a mixture of vindication and disbelief. For years, they had relied on my presence, my pension, and my compliance to maintain a facade of stability. Every complaint, every subtle reprimand, every demand for my contribution had been designed to assert control, to make me invisible, yet indispensable. Now stripped of my support, the foundation they had so confidently built was crumbling. Even more astonishing was the news about the furniture, the pieces that had once belonged to me, including the dresser, where I had stored decades of family memories, photographs of David, and the early drawings of Ava and Mark. The items had been sold for a fraction of their value, moved to a new home where they would no longer symbolize authority or control over my life. The realization settled in slowly. The very objects they had sought to use against me were now part of a narrative I no longer inhabited. Elaine had lost more than the physical assets. She had lost the illusion of power. The apartment that had once been a stage for manipulation and control was no longer hers. The meticulous calculations, the reliance on my pension, the expectation that I would continue to provide every detail had been disrupted. The weight of her planning, so long used to enforce dominance, had become irrelevant. Patricia and I spoke about the developments over coffee one morning, the city quiet around us. She shook her head with a mixture of astonishment and satisfaction. "It's ironic, isn't it?" she said. "All those years of scheming, and now they're the ones facing instability." I nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile crossing my lips. The universe had a way of correcting imbalances, and while I did not revel in their misfortune, I allowed myself the recognition that justice, delayed though it was, had a weight that could not be ignored. I thought about the years of humiliation, the subtle cruelties, and the silent labor that had been expected without acknowledgement. Every snide remark, every dismissed effort, every moment of invisible sacrifice had contributed to this moment of clarity. Elaine and Ron had assumed they could build a life entirely dependent on my compliance. They had misjudged the endurance of those they sought to control. Yet the relief was tempered with reflection. I did not feel joy in their downfall, nor did I seek it. The cost had been borne by years of tension, emotional exhaustion, and careful observation. My own life had been constrained by their expectations, and while the shift in circumstances was undeniable, it was a reminder of the fragile nature of authority built on the subjugation of others. As the days passed, news continued to trickle in: visits from prospective buyers, the movement of possessions, and the gradual disappearance of the household that had once seemed invulnerable. Each update reinforced a truth I had long suspected: control could not be maintained through coercion and manipulation. When exposed, carried consequences far beyond the immediate. I walked along the streets of Lincoln Park that afternoon, the winter air crisp against my cheeks. The sunlight glinted off the frost, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet affirmation that the actions I had taken to reclaim my life had ripple effects. The cost of cruelty, delayed though it was, had finally made itself known, and in the balance of justice, I could sense the faint, enduring satisfaction of integrity upheld. The envelope arrived on a crisp morning, its familiar handwriting immediately recognizable, though the ink carried the weight of months I had not anticipated. I held it carefully, feeling the texture of the paper and the subtle crease where it had been folded. It was Elaine's writing, smaller and more deliberate than I remembered. A child's neat script evolved into the tentative hand of an adult attempting humility. I sat by the window, winter light falling softly across the table as I opened the letter, each word pulling me back into memories of a home I had once considered mine. "Dear Mom," it began, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness after everything that has happened, but I need to say these things while I still can." Her words trembled with honesty, a vulnerability I had rarely seen in the woman who had once wielded control with quiet calculation. She acknowledged the ways she had manipulated, dismissed, and belittled me over the years. The calculated plans, the financial reliance, and the cold disregard that had turned a mother into a shadow in her own family's life. We lost sight of what mattered most. The children, the home, and you, the mother, who gave everything without complaint, were treated as obstacles rather than family. I read slowly, absorbing each sentence with careful detachment. There was no pretense, no attempt to shift blame, only an admission of past cruelty and the consequences of her actions. She wrote of sleepless nights, spent reflecting of regrets formed in the quiet moments when the weight of her own decisions had become undeniable. I understand now how much pain I caused and how much I took for granted. I hope that someday, even if it is brief, we can find a way to respect and acknowledge each other again. I set the letter down for a moment, letting the words sink. There was no rush to respond, no flare of anger, no desire for immediate reconciliation. Instead, I allowed myself to reflect on the journey that had brought me here, from humiliation at the Christmas table to reclaiming my autonomy, from quiet observation to decisive action. Elaine's remorse, genuine as it appeared, did not undo the past, nor did it erase the careful planning and manipulation I had endured. Yet there was a strange weight lifted in the act of acknowledgement. The recognition of wrongdoing, however delayed, held a power of its own. I traced the edges of the envelope with my fingers, contemplating the delicate balance between justice and grace. The years of pain and effort had culminated not in retaliation, but in clarity. And now her words provided closure I had not sought, but quietly welcomed. I thought of the children Ava and Mark, whose innocence had been caught in the crossfire. Elaine's letter acknowledged them too, a recognition of the subtle burdens she had placed on their young shoulders. I smiled faintly, imagining the possibility of restoring a limited relationship, one guided by respect rather than obligation or fear. Folding the letter carefully, I placed it back in the envelope and slid it into my desk drawer. There was no urgency to act further. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet satisfaction of integrity, maintained of dignity, preserved without compromise. Her remorse had arrived, and while forgiveness was a choice I might extend in time, it was now mine to consider on my own terms. I leaned back in my chair, watching the winter light fade slowly across the balcony. The world outside continued indifferent and steady, but within me, a profound sense of peace had taken hold. Elaine had admitted her faults, but it was my life, my autonomy, and my reflection that truly mattered. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine from the small trees lining the quiet street. I stepped onto Patricia's balcony, the city lights twinkling like distant stars below, and felt a calm I had not known for years. The tension, the years of subtle humiliation and quiet labor had lifted, leaving only a sense of presence, of being fully here and fully myself. In my hands, I held the small lamp I had brought from my old apartment, the one that had witnessed so many solitary mornings and stormy nights. Simple as it was tonight, it symbolized more than illumination. It marked freedom, dignity, and the inner peace I had fought to reclaim. I placed the lamp carefully on the balcony railing and pressed the switch. The soft glow spread outward, casting gentle light across the tiles and reaching into the quiet of the city below. I watched the light stretch steady and unwavering, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel completely at ease. There was no need for vigilance, no need to brace against manipulation or fear. The past 3 years filled with effort and endurance had led me to this moment. Patricia's voice came softly from the kitchen. "You've done well, Serafina." I nodded, letting the warmth of her words reinforce what I already knew. This light, this simple act was for me. It was a declaration of autonomy, a reminder that my presence belonged solely to myself now. I leaned against the railing, the soft glow reflecting in my eyes. I thought of Elaine, her letter of remorse, and the children who had been caught between innocence and the weight of adult mistakes. The lamp did not erase the past, but it marked the reclamation of my life. As darkness settled over the streets, the lamp continued to glow steadfast and quiet. And in that light, I felt a profound sense of completion, freedom from control, dignity intact, and a calm that had been long denied. For the first time in years, I could breathe fully, knowing that the life I lived was my own, and that peace had finally taken its rightful place.